A billionaire's autistic son was born paralyzed, a condition doctors said would never improve. For years, specialists tried everything, but the boy remained silent and unable to move. His father, one of the richest men in the world, spared no effort. He built therapy rooms, hired world-class doctors, and spent millions looking for answers. Nothing worked. Then a new butler was hired. He wasn't a nurse. He wasn't a doctor, just someone with patience and attention. But within weeks, he noticed something no one else had. A small reaction, a sound, a smile. He kept observing and slowly, piece by piece, uncovered the real reason behind the boy's condition. What he discovered shocked everyone and would change the boy's life forever. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We'd love to know that. Alexander Harrington was once a powerful businessman known across the world. People saw him on magazine covers and admired his success. But now, at 43, Alexander was no longer in the spotlight. He lived quietly in a huge mansion, far from interviews and cameras. That mansion, full of expensive things, felt empty without laughter or company. It was a lonely place. Alexander had made a lot of money with smart strategies and long hours of work, but those things didn't matter anymore. His wife had passed away, and since then, he focused only on his son, Ethan. Ethan was 6 years old, had autism, used a wheelchair, and had Down syndrome. Alexander had hired doctors, bought the best equipment, and worked with many therapists. Hi. He tried everything, but Ethan never spoke. Alexander, once cold and strong in business meetings, felt weak now. The silence from his son hurt more than any loss or failure he had faced before. Every day, Alexander followed the same routine. He woke up early, helped Ethan get ready, and made breakfast himself. He didn't trust anyone else with his son. They sat at a long table, but Ethan never looked at him. Alexander spoke gently, asked questions, and told small stories. Ethan stayed quiet, eyes focused on nothing in particular. After breakfast, Alexander pushed his wheelchair into the therapy room, space filled with colorful toys, machines, and tools. Therapists came and went, trying different methods, pictures, sounds, even animals. But Ethan remained still and silent. Alexander watched every session, hoping to see a reaction, even a small one. Sometimes Ethan flinched or looked around, but he never spoke. Alexander often asked himself what he was doing wrong. He wanted to connect. He wanted to hear his son's voice, not for recognition or reward, just to know that Ethan was there inside and trying. The silence felt like a wall Alexander couldn't break. Alexander's mind was full of questions and worries. He read every article and book he could find about children like Ethan. He talked to doctors, traveled for consultations, and bought the newest devices. He spared no expense, hoping one of them might finally help his son communicate. Tried speech therapy, music therapy, even sign language. Nothing worked. Each failed attempt brought disappointment, but Alexander never stopped. He remembered how easy it had been to control business deals, how simple numbers and logic had seemed. But now with his own son, none of that helped. Ethan didn't respond to logic or money. Alexander spent nights awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft sounds from the baby monitor next to his bed. He worried about the future. What would happen to Ethan when he wasn't around anymore? Who would care for him? The thought filled Alexander with fear. He felt helpless, something he had never felt before in his life. Despite everything, Alexander didn't give up. Each morning, he tried again. He talked to Ethan as if he could understand every word, told him about the weather, the trees outside, and even stories from when he was a child. He played music in the background, soft, calm songs he thought Ethan might like. Sometimes he played games, hoping Ethan would show interest. He even tried cooking new meals, thinking different smells or textures might spark something. Smile, a noise, a glance, anything would be enough. But the silence continued. Ethan showed no signs that he was listening. Alexander began to feel like he was the only one trying. He felt like he was living in a world where only he spoke, and Ethan didn't want to join in. Yet he kept trying, not because he had hope of change, but because it was the only way he knew to show love. Silence or not, Ethan was his son. Some days were harder than others. Alexander would feel frustration rise, but he always held it back. He never raised his voice, never showed anger. he knew it wasn't Ethan's fault. When therapists failed, Alexander didn't blame them. Instead, he would thank them and continue searching. He learned patience in a way he never had before. In business, time was money. At home, time was simply waiting for something to happen, waiting for a moment that might never come. Alexander had meetings with specialists who told him not to expect too much. They used soft words like acceptance and realistic expectations. Alexander listened, but didn't fully agree. Deep down, he believed that Ethan was capable of more, just didn't know how to reach him. Every small moment, a movement of Ethan's hand, a change in expression was studied closely. Alexander was always looking for clues, signs, or patterns. It became his full-time job, more important than anything he had done before. One afternoon, as sunlight entered the wide windows of the mansion, Alexander sat beside Ethan in the living room. He was tired, but he didn't show it. He placed a small toy in Ethan's hand and watched. Ethan didn't react. Minutes passed. Then Alexander began speaking softly like always. He told a story about his wife, about how she had loved music. He described a day at the beach long ago, before Ethan was born. His voice was calm and slow. He didn't expect a reply. He just wanted to be close. He looked at Ethan and smiled gently. Ethan didn't look back. His eyes remained distant. The toy slipped from his hand and fell to the floor. Alexander picked it up and gave it back to him. Still no reaction. He sighed and leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling. The silence between them continued. And in that silence, more than anything, Alexander felt the weight of being a father who only wanted one thing: to hear his son say a single word. Albert Thompson was 65 years old and had just experienced the worst moment of his life. Not long ago, his newborn grandson had passed away unexpectedly. It happened suddenly, and nothing could have prepared him for the pain. Since then, Albert had been trying to stay strong. He didn't talk much about it. Most people around him avoided the topic. The silence made it worse. He spent days at home not knowing what to do, unable to sleep well or eat properly. After a few weeks, he decided he needed to do something to feel alive again. That was when he found the job offer. It wasn't glamorous or exciting, but it was a fresh start. He accepted a position as a butler at the Harrington mansion. Albert didn't care about the size of the house or who lived there. He just wanted peace and routine. With quiet determination, he packed his few belongings and took a bus toward the new place. When Albert arrived at the mansion, he noticed how quiet it was. Everything was perfectly clean and well organized, but there was a strange feeling in the air, like the house was frozen in time. A man greeted him, Alexander Harrington. He was polite but distant, speaking clearly and without emotion. He explained his duties and told him about his son, Ethan. Albert listened without interrupting. He had worked in other homes before, but something about this job felt different. As he walked through the hallways and rooms, he noticed how many things were made for a child. Therapy equipment, colorful books, toys, soft chairs, but there was no noise, no laughter. Later, when he saw Ethan for the first time, he was sitting quietly in his wheelchair, not looking at anyone. Albert didn't say anything. He simply nodded to Alexander and began his tasks. He didn't feel nervous. He knew he had come there for a reason, even if he didn't know what it was yet. Albert didn't act like the other staff who had worked there before. He didn't treat Ethan with fake kindness or forced smiles. He didn't speak to him loudly or try to get a reaction. He simply did his work and stayed close when needed. Sometimes he cleaned the room while Ethan was present. He made sure not to make loud noises or move quickly. He noticed how easily he became overwhelmed, but he also noticed how calm he became when someone didn't force anything on him, so he respected that. When he finished his tasks, he sometimes sat on a chair nearby, doing nothing in particular, just being present. Ethan didn't look at him, but he didn't seem bothered by his presence either. Alexander watched this from a distance, surprised. Most new workers tried too hard or gave up quickly. Albert didn't do either. He was just there calmly, without questions or expectations. And somehow that started to matter. Over the next few days, Alexander started to notice small changes. Albert was quiet, but his presence seemed to bring a different energy to the house. It wasn't that Ethan reacted to him in any big way. He still didn't speak, didn't make eye contact, and barely moved. But something felt easier. He no longer turned away when he entered the room. He no longer stiffened when he placed something near him. It was hard to explain, but Alexander felt it. One day, Albert placed a small toy in front of Ethan. He didn't say anything, just left it there and returned to his cleaning. Ethan didn't touch it, but he looked at it for a few seconds longer than usual. Alexander saw it. Albert didn't point it out or make a comment. He just continued his work. That simple, respectful approach was new. Alexander had never seen someone handle things like that before. It made him curious about who Albert really was. Alexander slowly began to talk more with Albert. It wasn't much at first, just small comments, polite questions, but he answered with honesty and never tried to impress him. Eventually, he told him about his grandson. He didn't cry or ask for sympathy, just explained it like someone who had accepted something painful but wanted to keep moving. Alexander was surprised by his honesty. Didn't know what to say, but Albert didn't seem to need comfort. He just wanted to be understood. That made him respect him more. Over time, Albert became more than just a butler. He became a part of the house's quiet routine. He fit into the silence instead of trying to break it. Alexander appreciated that. He had grown used to being alone with Ethan, thinking no one else could understand. But Albert didn't try to understand everything. He just stayed, and that was enough. His presence didn't fix anything, but it helped. The most surprising thing happened on a regular afternoon. Albert was folding laundry in the living room while Ethan sat nearby, staring out the window. Without thinking much, he began humming softly. It wasn't a song with words, just a simple melody. Alexander walked in and paused. He expected Ethan to ignore it like always, but this time, Ethan moved his head slightly. It was almost nothing, just a small tilt toward the sound. Albert didn't even look up. He just kept humming. Alexander stood still, not wanting to interrupt. After a minute, Ethan's fingers twitched a little. Again, it wasn't much, but to Alexander, it was everything. It was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, something was changing. Albert didn't celebrate. He didn't say anything afterward. He just kept working like usual. But in that small moment, Alexander realized the silence between them all had shifted a little, and it started the day Albert arrived at the mansion. Over time, Albert started noticing small things in Ethan's behavior. At first, they didn't seem important, but the more time he spent with him, the more he began to pick up on patterns. Ethan had his own way of reacting to the world. He didn't talk, didn't make eye contact, and rarely moved much, but there were little signs. He would turn his head slightly when certain noises happened, like when someone poured a glass of water or when it rained outside. He didn't react the same way to music or voices, but sounds related to water made him seem more awake. Albert started testing this. He would run the faucet slowly when cleaning, and he noticed his fingers moved more when he heard it. When it rained, he would open a window just a bit, and Ethan would sit more calmly. It wasn't much, but Albert paid attention. He didn't rush anything. He just kept observing day by day. One afternoon, he was pushing Ethan's wheelchair through the garden behind the mansion. It was a quiet area, with trimmed grass, bushes, and a few tall trees. The air was warm and the sky was clear. As they walked, Albert noticed a slight change in Ethan's posture. He was sitting a little straighter and moving his fingers. He followed his gaze and saw he was looking toward the pool at the far end of the garden. The water made soft splashing noises as the filter system moved it around. Albert stopped the wheelchair. Ethan kept looking at the water. His lips were closed, but there was a very faint smile. His hands moved again, just slightly, but enough to show that something was happening inside him. Albert leaned down and said quietly, "You like that, huh?" He didn't expect a reply, of course, but he felt like he understood. That simple moment made him feel hopeful. Maybe he had found something that truly reached him. From that day on, Albert made a small change in their daily routine. Every morning after breakfast and before the therapy session, he took Ethan outside for a short walk to the pool area. He didn't force anything. If Ethan didn't want to go one day, he wouldn't push it. But most days, he stayed calm during the trip. When they got close to the water, he would park his wheelchair nearby under some shade. They sat there for a while listening. Sometimes the wind moved the water a little. Sometimes birds landed close. Ethan still didn't speak or react like other kids, but his body language was different now. He seemed more comfortable. He wasn't as stiff. His fingers moved slowly, rhythmically. Albert noticed he didn't blink as much. He was focused. didn't try to make it more than what it was, but it was clear something inside Ethan responded to the sound and movement of the water. As the days passed, Albert started seeing even more signs. Ethan's shoulders relaxed near the water. Once when he gently splashed his hand into the pool, he turned his head quickly toward the sound. It was the fastest reaction he had ever seen from him. He didn't make a big deal of it. He just kept doing what felt natural. Sometimes he would sit next to him and let his fingers tap the edge of the pool. Occasionally he spoke softly to him, not expecting a response, just keeping him company. He noticed his breathing became slower during these moments. One day, while he was cleaning near the garden, later in the afternoon, Ethan made a soft sound. It wasn't a word, just a noise, but it was new. It came right after they returned from the pool.
Albert froze.
He didn't know what it meant, but it felt like something important. He didn't tell Alexander yet. He wanted to be sure. Albert started asking himself deeper questions. What if the pool was more than just something Ethan liked? What if it could become a tool, a way to connect with him more directly? He'd read that water therapy sometimes helped children with special needs, especially those with sensory issues. The feeling of water, the sounds it made, and the gentle pressure could be calming or even stimulating. But he didn't want to get ahead of himself. He knew how easy it was to see meaning where there was none. Still, the signs were there. He considered speaking to Alexander, but he hesitated. He had seen so many professionals try and fail. He didn't want to be just another person with a suggestion that led nowhere. But inside, he felt like this wasn't just a guess. It was something real. He had watched Ethan closely, and this wasn't just coincidence. There was joy, real joy, in those small hand movements and slight smiles. One morning, after a night of thinking, Albert decided to bring it up. Alexander was in his office going through documents. He knocked and waited. When he looked up, he entered and spoke carefully. He told him what he had seen, how Ethan responded to the pool, how his hands moved differently, how his body relaxed. He mentioned the sound of water and how Ethan seemed drawn to it. Alexander listened without interrupting, didn't react strongly, but he didn't brush it off either. After a pause, he said, "Let's try something." That afternoon, the three of them went outside. Albert led Ethan's wheelchair while Alexander walked beside them. They sat near the pool like before. Albert touched the water and made small splashes. Ethan watched just as he had before. Alexander leaned down and looked at his son. He saw the movement in the hands. He saw the small smile, and for the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, something was finally starting to change. It was a hot late afternoon, and the sun still hung above the backyard when Albert decided it was time to try something new. He had thought about it for days, maybe even weeks. Every time he and Ethan visited the pool, he showed more comfort, more interest. He moved his hands more, breathed calmly, and sometimes made soft sounds. But today felt different. Albert had a small flotation vest ready. He had asked permission from Alexander earlier in the week, and though he didn't say yes directly, he also didn't say no. That was enough for him. Carefully helped Ethan into the vest, checking every strap and making sure it fit snugly. He didn't resist, which already felt like a win. With slow movements, he sat by the edge of the pool, holding him close. Then, keeping one arm tightly around him, he slowly stepped down into the water, both of them entering together for the first time. Ethan's body reacted immediately to the water. His arms tensed, and he pulled his shoulders up slightly. Albert held him tighter. "It's okay, I've got you," he whispered. He didn't rush anything. They stayed by the pool's edge for a few moments, letting him get used to the new feeling. The water reached his chest, and he could feel him trembling slightly, but he didn't scream, didn't panic. Slowly, his body adjusted. Albert moved backward just a little, letting the water carry more of his weight. The float kept him up, and his arms stayed firmly around his waist. After a few more seconds, something changed. His shoulders dropped, his hands moved through the water gently, and his head tilted back. Then, out of nowhere, he let out a small, quick laugh. It was a short, clear giggle. Albert froze, his eyes wide. He had never heard that sound from him before. His heart jumped. For a moment, Albert didn't know what to do. His chest tightened, and he felt a strange mix of happiness and fear. He didn't want to scare him by reacting too much, but he couldn't help it. His eyes filled with tears, and a quiet laugh escaped his lips. He kept holding him, floating slowly in the water, moving in small circles. Ethan didn't laugh again, but his face stayed calm. He seemed to enjoy it. He wasn't stiff. His fingers moved along the surface of the water, feeling it splashing just a bit. Albert watched every small movement like it was the most important thing in the world. He thought about all the days he had sat near this pool with him, hoping for something, anything. And now here he was, floating, relaxed, and laughing. It was just one sound, but to him it meant everything. He whispered to him again, "You did it, Ethan. You really did it." He hadn't planned to go outside, but something had made him stop working and look through the window. He had seen Albert walking Ethan toward the pool earlier and felt unsure about it. Now curious, he stepped outside and followed the path. As he reached the edge of the yard, he stopped. In front of him, just a few meters away, he saw his son in the water, floating, being held by Albert. He couldn't move for a second, his eyes focused on the boy's face. He saw the way Ethan moved his hands. He saw the way Albert held him with care. Then he heard the sound. Ethan laughed again, just once, short and light. It was faint but clear. Alexander's heart pounded. He couldn't believe it. His son was laughing, in water, with someone else with him. At first, Alexander's reaction was confusion. He didn't know what to feel. He had always been protective, cautious, maybe even too controlling. He never trusted anyone fully with Ethan, and now here was Albert doing something he had never managed to do. He had taken his son into the water without fear. It made him laugh. Alexander took a step closer but didn't interrupt. Kept watching, realizing something was happening that he couldn't ignore. His fear, the fear that something would go wrong, that Ethan would get hurt, that people wouldn't understand, began to fade. He saw that Albert wasn't forcing anything. He was calm, patient, and fully focused on Ethan. He was helping him feel safe. Alexander felt a lump in his throat. He'd waited years for a moment like this, and it wasn't happening in therapy or with a doctor or in some special program. It was happening right here in his backyard with a man who simply cared. As Albert turned toward the garden and saw Alexander standing there, he froze for a second, but then he nodded gently, as if asking for his silent approval. He didn't speak. He simply nodded back and walked a little closer, still keeping distance. Ethan didn't notice. He was focused on the water, on the feeling of floating, and on Albert's arm around him. Alexander sat down slowly on a nearby chair, watching the scene unfold. He didn't try to take control, he just watched. The tension between him and Albert had always been unspoken, full of limits and formal lines. But now, something had changed. This wasn't about roles or titles anymore. This was about Ethan, and for the first time he was smiling. Albert continued moving slowly through the water with the boy, his expression soft and emotional, and Alexander, sitting there, finally understood this wasn't just a swim. It was the beginning of something much bigger than fear. Alexander walked slowly toward the pool. His steps were steady, but his heart was beating fast. He had just seen his son laugh for the first time. That alone had shaken something inside him. Now, as he got closer, his eyes stayed on Ethan. The boy was still floating in the water, supported by Albert, who held him with calm and care. Alexander didn't want to interrupt. He didn't want to break whatever was happening. He stayed quiet, watching every movement. Albert didn't say a word either. He kept Ethan close, his hands steady. Then something unexpected happened. As Alexander stood near the edge, Ethan turned his head toward him. It was a slow, deliberate movement. Their eyes met, and then, in a soft voice, Ethan said, "Daddy," just one word. It was quiet, barely above a whisper, but it was clear. Alexander froze. His body went still. His eyes widened. He had waited years for this moment. The word echoed in Alexander's mind. "Daddy." Couldn't believe it. He stared at Ethan, hoping he had heard right, afraid to even breathe in case it was just his imagination. But it was real. It had happened. Alexander's legs gave out, and he dropped to his knees by the edge of the pool. His hands trembled. He didn't care about his clothes getting wet or how he looked. Tears streamed down his face without control. Years of pain, frustration, fear, and helplessness came pouring out. He had lived in silence for so long, thinking his son might never speak. He had accepted it, or at least told himself he had. But now, with just one word, everything changed. Albert stayed still in the water, his arms around Ethan. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes met Alexander's, and they both understood the weight of that moment. Nothing needed to be explained. It was the kind of moment that spoke for itself. Ethan didn't repeat the word, but he looked calm. His fingers were still moving slightly in the water and his breathing was steady. He didn't seem afraid or confused. In fact, he looked more present than ever before. Albert gently adjusted his hold on him to keep him comfortable. Alexander wiped his face with both hands, trying to catch his breath. He looked at his son again, studying every detail of his face. Ethan wasn't just reacting to the water or a moment of comfort. He had made a connection. He had looked at his father and chosen to speak. That meant more than any therapy report or medical update ever had. Alexander reached out and touched Ethan's hand slowly, carefully. Ethan didn't pull away. He let his hand rest there, soft and light. Alexander turned to Albert and said in a quiet voice, "Thank you." He didn't answer. He just nodded once, his expression gentle and steady. Alexander sat on the ground beside the pool, not ready to stand. He wanted to stay close. He wanted to remember every second. He watched his son floating, still held safely in Albert's arms. For the first time, he didn't feel powerless, didn't feel lost or unsure. He felt connected. He realized something important. Ethan had never been incapable of speaking. He had never been completely closed off. He had just never felt safe enough to let something out. It wasn't about teaching him or fixing him. It was about giving him space. A space without pressure. A space where silence wasn't a failure. Albert had created that space. With simple actions, patience, presence, calm. Alexander had spent years looking for solutions in expensive places, chasing results. But the answer had been something smaller and quieter. Freedom to feel safe, to express. Alexander watched Ethan move in the water, and for the first time, he believed in real progress. Albert continued to float with Ethan for a few more minutes. He didn't rush anything. He could feel the change in the boy's posture. He trusted him. His body was relaxed. He wasn't just tolerating the experience, he was participating in it. Every small movement he made felt intentional. Albert looked at Alexander again, and this time he saw something new in his face. It wasn't just shock or emotion, it was understanding. He had seen what he had been noticing for weeks. That Ethan wasn't unreachable. The silence wasn't a wall, it was a protection. And now, for the first time, that protection had started to come down. They stayed in that moment a little longer, no one in a hurry to move. It was like everything had paused around them, giving space for this one truth. Ethan had spoken, not just with his mouth, but with his whole presence. And that moment had changed everything for all of them. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Albert slowly guided Ethan back toward the edge of the pool. He helped him out gently, drying him with a towel he had prepared. Alexander stood and took the towel from him, finishing the job silently. Together they dressed him and placed him in his wheelchair. Ethan was calm, his head tilted slightly, his eyes open and alert. Alexander looked down at him, still unable to believe what had happened. One word had broken through years of silence, but more than that, it had opened a new door. He looked at Albert, and something in his heart shifted. He no longer saw him as just an employee. He had done something no expert had ever done. He had reached his son. And right there, with the last bit of sunlight touching the ground, Alexander understood something had awakened today in Ethan, in himself, and in Albert. Something real, something alive. The pool had slowly become the most important part of the house. What once was just a quiet backyard feature was now the center of Ethan's world. Each morning after breakfast, he would smile and point toward the glass door leading to the backyard. Sometimes he would tap the armrest of his wheelchair and look at Albert, waiting for him to understand. It didn't take much. Albert knew exactly what he wanted. Alexander watched this change with quiet amazement. Ethan, who once showed no clear interest in anything, now had a routine he enjoyed. The moment they stepped outside, Ethan would sit up straighter. His eyes would focus, and his hands would move gently in the air. He started making soft sounds as they approached the pool, almost like humming. It was his way of expressing excitement. Alexander joined them often now, standing nearby or sitting on the edge, soaking in each small piece of progress like it was something sacred. Albert began to bring new elements to their sessions by the pool. He introduced water games with floating toys, some soft, some colorful, some that made gentle noises when squeezed. He also played calm music in the background, sometimes singing quietly to Ethan. He reacted more and more. He reached for the toys, splashed softly, and even laughed at times. One toy in particular, A yellow plastic duck caught his attention. He held it longer than the others and watched it float with focus. Albert noticed and used it often in their time together. He also brought books with simple pictures, reading them aloud near the water's edge. Sometimes he pointed to images and named them, pausing to see if Ethan would react, and he did. He would touch the pictures, make small sounds, or tap the pages. These weren't random movements anymore. They were clear responses. Communication had started. Alexander, always nearby, observed with silent gratitude, slowly realizing how much his son had been waiting to be understood. Then, during one of those afternoon sessions, something incredible happened. Albert sat on a towel beside the pool with Ethan in his chair next to him. He handed him the familiar yellow duck. Ethan looked at it, then looked at him. Without hesitation, he pointed at the toy and said, "Duck." His voice was quiet but clear. Albert froze. He wasn't sure he had heard correctly. "Duck!" he repeated, pointing to it again. Ethan looked at the toy and nodded slightly. "Duck," he said again. It was the second word he had ever spoken. Albert smiled, holding back tears, and turned to Alexander, who had seen and heard everything from just a few steps away. His expression changed instantly. Shock, joy, disbelief, all mixed into one. He walked over and knelt beside Ethan. "That's right," he said softly. "Duck." It was a moment of celebration, not because of the word alone, but because of what it meant. Ethan was learning to speak, and more importantly, he was choosing to. After that day, the sessions near the pool became even more special. Alexander made time for them every afternoon, no matter how busy his schedule was. He no longer watched from a distance. He participated, helped dry off toys, sat on the floor to read stories, and even joined the games when he felt confident enough. Albert kept guiding things calmly, never forcing progress, always letting Ethan set the pace. The boy responded with smiles, noises, and more eye contact than ever before. He didn't say many more words, but he was clearly communicating. When he was happy, he made sounds and flapped his hands. When he was confused, he looked at Albert for direction. When he liked a story, he touched the page and gave a small laugh. These were small things to others, but to Alexander and Albert, they were major steps. The pool area had become more than just a place to play. It was where Ethan felt safe, connected, and free. Albert began keeping a notebook. Every time Ethan made a new sound, pointed at something, or responded to a story, he wrote it down. He shared the notes with Alexander, who read each page carefully. They talked about new strategies, new books to try, and different toys to introduce. They worked like a team, always focusing on what Ethan enjoyed most. One day, Albert brought finger paints to the poolside, spreading a plastic mat on the ground. He guided Ethan's hands through the colors, and to their surprise, he didn't pull away. He touched the paper, smeared blue and yellow together, and even smiled when Alexander dipped his own fingers into the paint. Another time they played with bubbles, and Ethan reached for them with genuine excitement. These activities weren't just for fun, they were building blocks. Each one taught Ethan something: cause and effect, texture, communication. And slowly, his own way of talking was becoming clearer every day. The words still came slowly, and most of the time Ethan used gestures, facial expressions, and simple sounds. But that didn't matter anymore. Alexander and Albert had learned to listen differently. They no longer expected full sentences or perfect pronunciation. They understood the pauses, the hand movements, the quiet laughs. It was a new kind of language, one built with patience and trust. For the first time, Ethan wasn't being taught how to be someone else. He was being supported to be himself. Alexander finally saw that his son didn't need to be fixed. He needed to be heard. He needed people to meet him where he was, not where they expected him to be. And Albert had given him that. It created a bridge between silence and understanding. That afternoon, as the three of them sat by the pool, Ethan leaned his head against Albert's arm. He smiled. Alexander smiled too.
Ow!
The words were rare, but the connection was real. The boy was finally being heard. While organizing some shelves in the office, Albert came across a locked drawer. He found the key in the top drawer of Alexander's desk and opened it without thinking much. Inside there were several old folders and envelopes. Most of them were unimportant. Bills, insurance documents, papers from the past. But one folder stood out. It was labeled Ethan Medical History. Albert hesitated before opening it. When he did, He saw dozens of reports from a neurologist who had treated Ethan for years. As he read through them, his face changed. The reports described procedures and medications that didn't make sense to him. Words like emotional containment, compliance reinforcement, and behavioral suppression were used repeatedly. The doctor had prescribed heavy medication for long periods, not for treatment, but for control. Albert's hands trembled as he kept reading. There were notes about limiting stimuli, isolating Ethan during episodes, and even restricting physical contact. The reports felt cold and inhuman. Something was very wrong. Albert couldn't ignore what he had read. The more pages he turned, the worse it got. One report even mentioned using a restraint chair during sessions to ensure safety and limit resistance. There were notes suggesting that Ethan's silence was permanent and that language development is unlikely. But what bothered him the most was how all these decisions had been accepted without question. Ethan had been treated as a problem to be controlled, not a child to be understood. Albert dug deeper. He looked up the neurologist's name online and found articles, reviews, and medical board complaints. To his horror, he discovered several families had spoken out about similar experiences. Children who had been over-medicated, kids who had suffered side effects, both physical and emotional. The doctor had faced investigations in the past, but had continued practicing. Albert felt sick. He closed the folder and sat in silence, trying to decide what to do. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself. Later that evening, Albert waited until Ethan was asleep, walked into Alexander's study, folder in hand. He was sitting on the couch reading when he looked up and saw his serious expression. He sat across from him and began to explain everything he had found. He didn't hold back, read him the most disturbing parts of the reports and showed him the research he had done. Alexander listened quietly at first, then grew visibly shaken. His face turned pale and he sat forward, elbows on his knees, hands covering his mouth. He had trusted that doctor for years. He believed he was doing what was best for his son. Now he realized he had allowed treatments that might have hurt Ethan. He had paid for it, signed the papers, and never asked enough questions. He felt guilt creeping in fast, heavier than anything he had felt before. His voice cracked when he finally asked, "How could I not have known?" He saw the pain in his eyes and understood how easy it was to trust people in white coats with serious titles. But he also believed it was time to act. Alexander agreed. They couldn't stay quiet. Together, they made a plan. First, they gathered every document, printed every article, and saved testimonies from other families. Then, they contacted a lawyer who specialized in medical ethics and malpractice. They also reached out to a journalist who had written pieces about flawed medical systems. It wasn't just about Ethan anymore. They wanted to make sure other children wouldn't go through the same nightmare. The process was slow and emotionally draining. They gave interviews, wrote statements, and supported the investigation. Every time they revisited the files, Alexander felt the guilt return. But he didn't run from it. This was his chance to fix what he had allowed for too long. He knew this wasn't about revenge. It was about truth and protection. At home, despite the tension of the case, life with Ethan continued to move forward. Albert and Alexander didn't let their mission interfere with his daily routine. In fact, they became more present than ever. Every small moment with him felt even more important now. Ethan kept making progress. He still preferred gestures and sounds, but now he made eye contact more often. He pointed to things he wanted and even tried new words once in a while. One day, while playing near the water, he said ball while holding one. Another time, he reached for a book and said read. Each moment was a reminder that his mind was working, learning, and growing. He wasn't broken. He had never been. Alexander looked at him differently now, not with pity or worry, but with respect. Albert noticed it too. The trauma from the past was real, but it wasn't the end of the story. Ethan's future was still wide open. Months passed, and the case moved forward. New stories were published, and more families came forward. The doctor's license was suspended while the investigation continued. Alexander and Albert were called to speak publicly more than once. Though it was hard, they didn't back down. They spoke for Ethan and for every child who had been treated like a case file instead of a person. At home, their bond with each other grew stronger. They were no longer employer and employee. They were a team bound by the shared goal of protecting someone they both loved deeply. Ethan, unaware of the storm his parents were fighting outside, kept discovering his world one little step at a time. His smile came more easily now. He laughed more. And when he said Albert for the first time, it was clear to both of them, this boy, once silenced by fear and misunderstanding, was finding his voice. Slowly but surely, Ethan was being set free. With the support of other parents, Alexander and Albert moved forward with everything they had. What began as a quiet search for answers had become a public mission for justice. They met with families who had also experienced the same mistreatment under the same doctor. They listened to heartbreaking stories and gathered every document they could find. Together, they compiled medical records, prescriptions, testimonies, and expert opinions. A team of journalists picked up the story and began publishing a series of reports. The truth started reaching more people. News channels covered the scandal and online platforms helped the story spread fast. The doctor was officially named in the reports and was accused of using unethical methods and neglecting patient well-being. Authorities opened an official investigation and the pressure grew. But none of it would have happened without the work Alexander and Albert had done. They didn't stop after exposing the truth. They made sure it would be heard by everyone who needed to listen. As the world outside reacted, things inside the mansion were changing too, but in a different way. While journalists called and lawyers handled statements, Ethan continued his quiet journey. His progress was steady. Albert began to notice his drawings. At first, they were just lines and shapes, but over time, colors started to appear. He used blue, yellow, and green. He chose the colors with care. Alexander hung some of the drawings on the wall near the pool. One day, Ethan said water while holding a crayon. Another day, he said sun while looking out the window. Then, unexpectedly, he said grandpa. It was soft and quick, but Albert heard it. Alexander heard it too. They both looked at each other, surprised and moved. These words didn't come from pressure or therapy. It came from Ethan himself. The same boy who once lived in complete silence was now expressing thoughts, memories, and feelings. He wasn't being taught how to speak. He was simply being given space to grow. One afternoon, while Albert was organizing books and Alexander was sitting nearby reading documents, Ethan came into the room holding a piece of paper. He had been drawing with crayons for a while. Albert smiled and asked him if he wanted to show them. Ethan walked slowly toward them, the paper in his small hands. He held it up, and they both leaned in. On the paper were 3 stick figures holding hands. One had short hair, one had gray hair, and the third in the middle had a rounder face and curly lines on top of the head. It was clear to them what it meant. Albert crouched down and asked, "Who were these?" Ethan looked at the drawing, then looked at both of them. "It's us," he said. His voice was soft, but the words were clear. Albert's eyes filled with tears, covered his mouth, and nodded. Alexander didn't speak, just looked at the drawing, feeling something deep and overwhelming inside. Albert sat next to Ethan on the floor and hugged him gently, not too tight, just enough. He didn't pull away. He rested his head on his shoulder for a few seconds before going back to his crayons. Alexander remained quiet, still watching. His heart was full. The silence he had once feared had turned into something beautiful. Not every day was perfect. Some days Ethan was quiet again or didn't want to talk, but that was okay. The difference was that now they understood him. They knew how to listen, even when there were no words. Alexander felt proud not just of Ethan, but of what they had built together. Albert had become more than just support. He was part of the family now. He had helped rebuild something he thought was lost forever. Their lives had changed. The house, once cold and quiet, had transformed into a space filled with color, noise, and real connection. There were still hard memories, and the past didn't disappear. Sometimes Alexander would look at the old medical files and feel the weight of guilt all over again. Albert still had moments where he remembered his grandson and felt the sting of that absence. But neither of them let the pain control their present. Instead, they used it to stay focused, to keep helping Ethan and to protect others. They continued working with the other families, attending meetings, and providing updates on the case. They spoke at events, talked to support groups, and answered emails from people going through the same things they had faced. They didn't hide anymore. Ethan's story was being used to help others, and in return, they received stories from parents who had found hope again. All of it reminded Alexander and Albert that what they were doing mattered. They had turned something dark into something honest. something that would bring real change to many lives. Inside the house, things had never been more alive. The kitchen echoed with Ethan's laughter when he liked a meal. The living room had toys, books, and colorful papers scattered across the floor. The hallway smelled like fresh paint, and Ethan's art filled the walls. Music played in the background some days, and on others they simply sat outside by the pool listening to the sounds of water. Alexander no longer avoided the memories of what was lost. Albert no longer hid his feelings, and Ethan, the center of it all, had found his place in the world. He spoke a little, drew a lot, and smiled freely. That day, when he showed them the drawing and said, "It's us," something shifted forever. It wasn't just a sweet moment, it was proof. The silence was no longer something to be afraid of. That house, once filled with loneliness and pain, now held voices, stories, and love. The past had left scars, but the present had become a home. The trial against the neurologist reached national attention faster than anyone expected. Once the first reports were broadcast, more families came forward, each with their own painful story. The courtroom was packed during the hearings. Parents described how their children had been misdiagnosed, overmedicated, or restrained without need. The evidence was overwhelming. Medical records, expert testimonies, and official documents showed a clear pattern of neglect and abuse. Alexander and Albert were present at every session. They spoke calmly, firmly, with all the truth they had collected. Journalists followed the case closely. Articles appeared daily, public reaction was strong, and social media helped spread awareness even further. When the final verdict came, there was no doubt left. The doctor was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced. It was a moment of justice, not just for Ethan, but for every child who had suffered in silence. Alexander and Albert didn't celebrate loudly, but deep inside they both felt a weight lift. Back at home, far from the courtroom chaos, life felt completely different. The mansion that once echoed with silence now had a soft hum of activity. Alexander had made a decision shortly after the trial began. He converted one of the empty rooms into an art studio, just for Ethan. He painted the walls white and installed large windows so the sunlight could fill the space. There were shelves with paints, crayons, markers, and colored paper. A low table and chairs made it easy for Ethan to sit and draw comfortably. Albert helped set everything up. The moment Ethan walked into the room for the first time, his eyes lit up. He ran his fingers along the shelves, picked out a crayon, and began drawing. Since that day, it became his favorite place in the house. Each morning after breakfast, he would go straight to the studio. He drew shapes, people, animals, and especially the things he loved most: water, sun, and his favorite color, pool blue. Albert had become more than just part of the routine. He was part of the family. His bond with Ethan had only grown stronger. He knew when he needed quiet, when he was ready to try new things, and how to encourage him without pressure. Some days he sang while he drew. Other times they painted together or read books on the floor. Ethan had started naming colors without being asked. Red, he'd say, pointing to a bright crayon. Yellow, blue. He loved saying blue, but especially pool blue. His version of the soft turquoise shade of the water he adored. He'd press the crayon hard against the paper, scribbling it with excitement. Albert would smile and ask him to describe his drawings, and sometimes he did. Slowly, words became part of their games. Alexander often stood quietly in the doorway, watching them, sometimes with a cup of coffee in hand. He didn't interrupt, just observed, grateful for the peace that had taken so long to arrive. Ethan's world was no longer limited to therapy rooms and quiet hallways. He explored the garden, played with simple toys, and sometimes helped Albert bake cookies. He made messes, got paint on his clothes, and sang short made-up songs while moving around the studio. Laughter filled the spaces that used to feel empty. Alexander realized how much his home had changed. There were signs of life everywhere. Art on the walls, toys under the table, books left open on the couch. It no longer looked like a museum. It felt lived in, felt warm. Alexander had started smiling more, not just out of politeness, but because he felt happy. Truly happy. He had been through so much pain, silence, and guilt. But now his house was filled with the very thing he thought he had lost. Joy. Not perfect, not constant, but real. Albert and Ethan had shown him that healing didn't need to be dramatic. just needed to be honest, without needing to say it out loud. The three of them had formed a new kind of family. There were no labels, no expectations. They had found comfort in small things, shared meals, quiet afternoons, and simple routines. Each had carried heavy memories from the past, but together, they were creating something new. Albert never tried to replace what had been lost, and Alexander never asked him to. He was just there, present, steady. Ethan responded to that with trust. One afternoon, he drew a picture of three people sitting in the sun. He pointed to the tallest and said, "Daddy," then to the one with gray hair, "Albert," and finally to the smaller one, "Me." Alexander kept that drawing on his desk. It reminded him that love could grow even after everything else had fallen apart. It didn't have to look like anyone else's story, just had to be real. And this, whatever it was real through and through. There was no final chapter, no perfect ending. But there was something better: stability, a new rhythm, a peaceful home. Alexander still had moments of doubt, sometimes remembering the years lost or the mistakes made. Albert still grieved his own pain quietly, but those moments didn't define them. What defined them now was the way they looked at each other at the dinner table. The way Ethan reached for their hands when walking through the yard. The way their lives had blended naturally without needing to force anything. The house, once so cold and quiet, was now full of meaning. Paintings on the fridge, music from the speaker, a half-finished puzzle on the floor. Alexander didn't need to chase answers anymore. He just needed to be present. And as he stood one afternoon watching Albert and Ethan laugh together under the sun, he realized something simple: love had arrived. Slowly, without noise, not as a reward, but as a result of truth, care, and time. Years had passed since the days of quiet afternoons by the pool and finger painting in the studio. Ethan was no longer the small boy who spoke only a few words and hid behind silence. He had grown into a confident young man with his own personality, interests, and voice. Story had slowly spread over time, first through friends, then community groups, then national media. People were inspired by how far he had come. Now, a large auditorium was filled with guests, families, and professionals from across the country. They had come to celebrate stories of resilience and growth. Ethan was one of the people being honored that evening. Dressed in a sharp blue suit, his favorite color, he waited backstage with Albert. He wasn't nervous. He was excited. His hands fidgeted a little, but his smile stayed wide. Albert looked at him with pride. He adjusted his collar just like he used to fix his drawings years ago, gently, patiently, with love. When the moment came, Ethan walked slowly onto the stage, holding Albert's hand. The audience stood up and applauded before he even reached the microphone. The stage lights shone brightly, but he didn't flinch. He stood tall, looking at the crowd without fear. Around his neck, a medal was placed, marking his journey. A symbolic moment for someone who had once been trapped in silence. Albert stood beside him, tears already forming in his eyes. Alexander was in the front row, smiling proudly, his hands resting on his knees. But what came next caught everyone by surprise. The presenter cleared his throat and held up a paper. Today, he said, we honor not just Ethan's journey, but the person who walked every step of it with him. Please join me in officially recognizing Albert Thompson as the adoptive grandfather and legal guardian of Ethan Harrington. For a second, the room went completely still. Then Albert covered his mouth with both hands as the emotion overwhelmed him. Albert had never asked for recognition. He had never imagined a title or ceremony. From the beginning, he had simply been there for Ethan, for Alexander, for the little things that filled their lives. But standing there now, with the announcement echoing in his ears, he felt something shift. Ethan turned to him and wrapped his arms around him. It wasn't just a hug. It was full of gratitude, trust, and deep love. Albert cried openly. His whole body trembled, and he couldn't stop the tears. Rested his forehead against Ethan's, whispering, "Thank you." In the audience, Alexander stood and began clapping. Others followed until the entire auditorium was on their feet. The applause was loud, long, and full of feeling. Albert and Ethan stayed in that hug for several seconds before turning back toward the presenter. A photographer captured the moment, one that would appear in news articles and online posts as a symbol of care, patience, and unconditional love. After the announcement, the host handed Ethan a small piece of paper. It was time for his speech. He walked toward the microphone, held the paper in both hands, and looked at the audience. He took a deep breath, and in a voice clear and calm, he said, "My light started at the pool." With him, he pointed to Albert and smiled. There were no complicated words, no long sentences, just that, simple and true. The room went completely silent. People held their breath. Even the cameras stopped clicking for a second. Then, as if all at once, the silence broke into loud applause, cheers, and even tears from some in the crowd. Alexander wiped his eyes with a tissue and sat back down, overwhelmed with emotion. It was the moment he had dreamed of during the darkest years. And now it was real. Ethan was not just being seen, he was being heard, celebrated, and understood on his own terms. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the lobby. People lined up to meet Ethan and Albert. Parents asked questions, teachers shared thanks, and strangers told them how deeply their story had touched them. Albert listened kindly, a little overwhelmed, but deeply moved. Ethan smiled at each person, sometimes nodding, sometimes answering quietly. Alexander joined them after a while and stood beside them, not as a businessman or a figure of power, but simply as Ethan's father. The three of them stood together as a unit. It was clear to anyone watching that they were a family bound not by blood, but by years of shared moments, hard choices, and slow victories. There were still challenges in Ethan's life. Of course, he still had days of quiet confusion and difficulty. But the difference now was that he wasn't alone. He had two people beside him who never stopped believing, even when the rest of the world did and understand. The evening ended with laughter, photos, and one last round of applause. As the family left the event together, they got into the car, Ethan holding the medal in one hand and Albert's hand in the other. Alexander drove, occasionally glancing back at them in the mirror. No one needed to say much. The silence between them was comfortable, full. When they got home, Ethan placed the medal on the table next to one of his old drawings, the one with the three of them holding hands. Albert looked at it and smiled. Alexander put his arm around him, and Ethan leaned against both of them. That night before bed, Albert tucked Ethan in like he always did. As he turned off the light, he said softly, "Good night, Grandpa." He paused for a second, his heart full. "Good night, my love," he whispered. Outside, the world was quiet, but inside that house, where it all began, there was nothing left but love and peace. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.